Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 187. Today I'm speaking with someone whose work I really admire, gardener, writer and garden advocate and educator Jennifer Jewell. Jennifer is the host of a podcast called Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden. Her show dives into the intersection between gardening, community and culture and aims to expand how we define and talk about gardens and gardeners. Speaking with Jennifer for this conversation, her passion for and belief in the power of gardeners to make positive change in this world shines through. We talk about Jennifer's first garden, the human connection with plants through history and across cultures, the lessons we can learn from plants, and Jennifer even gives me an insight into her own garden journaling practice. Let's listen. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me. This is a real treat.
Well, it is my great pleasure to be here and talk about these things we love.
Yeah. So you wrote a whole book about seeds, and we're going to talk about that a bit later, but I'd love to use that as a metaphor for the seeds of all this in your own young life. Can you talk to me about the seeds that were planted inside you that led to your love of gardens and growing?
Yeah. You know, it's a story that I have related I relate it frequently when I give talks, but the older I get, Bethan, the more nuance I see and the more layers I see to the way my parents transmitted their love to me. And it's really such an incredible gift. But I am the second daughter of 3 daughters of a professional gardening mother and a wildlife biologist father. And in many ways, they were very different people, but they were passionate people who loved what they loved. And my father loved animals and the wildlife around us, wherever we might be. He was a hunter and a fisher and a forager. And so by extension of loving animals, he loved the plants that took care of them and the plants where they made their homes and the plants that made their lives possible and how he could learn more about them. And my mother loved flowers. I think flowers more specifically than plants. She loved flowers. And they kind of, you know, reflected in their marriage how you can't actually have one without the other. Like you need the wildlife, you need the land, you need the plants in order to get the flowers, in order to feed it was all a cycle. And they expressed this in different ways, but together they really modeled this idea that knowing and respecting and partnering with, but also reveling in the joy of the land and plants and animals that are all around us all the time. They gave this gift to me and my sisters in spades, and we all hold it, but we express it differently as well. And some of my earliest memories are, you know, hiking and camping with my family when I was tiny. My father was doing his dissertation on hoof and mouth disease in mule deer on the western slope of Colorado.
Wow.
Like when I was just shortly after I was born. So my mother, God love her, she died 30 years ago, but I, as an older person and then becoming a mother myself, I keep wanting to say, how did you do that? That was hard to travel, you know, in the back of a car, set up the camp, feed everybody while my dad is doing his research. And she had a 3-year-old and a newborn. And we, you know, grew up crawling around in the dirt and picking flowers and having fun. And then she ultimately worked at a nursery. And another one of my earliest memories was like being taken to work with her because they didn't have childcare and my older sister was already in school. And, you know, just being allowed to like ramble underneath the potting tables and this like in Colorado, it is a cold winter.
Okay.
And that period of time when my mother would have been planting seeds or potting on seedlings from the seed trays into the little pots, right? This would have been a bitter cold time in Colorado. And so to be like romping around in my nappy and, you know, a like little onesie or something because the greenhouse was warm and humid and, you know, full of that delicious greenhouse smell that they take on. So those are my earliest memories of why soil and plants are just part of my DNA. Yeah.
This is amazing. What an incredible visual description of what must have been a life, a childhood completely steeped in nature. And of course you were going to go on to do what you did, but you studied English literature, is that right? And you did editing and then garden writing. Tell me about this and then tell me about starting your podcast, Cultivating Place.
Well, it you know, the way life, there are very few people I have met or interviewed, Bethan, who have a direct line of like here to there. Like, I want to be this, I'm going to be this, I am this. And I always loved words. I always loved reading and writing. And when I was, you know, kind of a young school-age person, I thought I wanted to be an artist and I thought I wanted to be a poet. One of the first books my mother gave me was the complete collection of Emily Dickinson poems. And it was just like magic to open that up. And then I went to school, and I started at Barnard College, which is part of Columbia University in New York. And I started right out of high school. And I did a lot of comparative religion and comparative literature. And I loved the learning, but I really was, you know, I was 19 and I think people should hear stories like this all the time. Sort of halfway through my second year, the city was depressing. It was a time of a lot of upheaval politically and economically in the U.S., mid-1980s. New York City was a mess of mental health problems and a lot of unhoused people because of the failure of our mental health institutions. And to a girl from, you know, Colorado, I had been to high school in the East, but I had never lived in a big city. And I think had someone talked me through it, they would have identified that I was just homesick for plants and green and fresh air. And, you know, and that maybe had I gone to Central Park a lot more because, you know, if it had been a safer place at that point, maybe I would not have dropped out. But I was so sad. And I remember walking out of a restaurant and going to a payphone. This is back in the days of payphones, 1985. And I called my parents and I said, I have to come home. And God loved them. They were like, on the next plane, come home. And, you know, so from there I kind of worked a little bit and then started to feel this itch of like, now I know why I want to go back. Now I can understand why I need to study more. And I can do it without like putting my whole family in debt with another undergraduate degree full time in New York City. So I went to school wherever we were with, where I was working, and ultimately finished up I did my last 2 years full time at Harvard and got a degree in English literature, really not knowing what I was going to do. You know, I knew I liked to write. I knew I liked to read. I knew I liked to communicate. I thought I would be a teacher. I went on and got my teacher's training. And then out of like by chance landed an editing job at Microsoft and worked there for 5 years. But it was at the exact same time. So we were living in Seattle at this point, and I started my first garden. like my first adult garden of my own.
What did you have in your first garden? What did it look like?
Oh, well, it was, for anyone who's not familiar with Seattle, Washington, it is the Pacific Northwest. It is a very moderate climate. It is warm and dry in the summer, but it is moist and green. It reminds you of like Ireland, what you think of as Ireland, or some of the East Coast, but more moderate, the East Coast of the U.S. I had everything you can think of. I had raspberries and roses and a crabapple, and I was that first young garden person, and you just are in love with every single thing you see. I'm like, I think I'll plant some delphinium today and maybe some aconitum, because that's so different. And I remember planting a whole like sort of perennial bed that had like dianthus and peonies and columbine and these delphinium and this aconitum, which was a strange combination of things altogether, but it didn't matter. The colors were pretty and the scent and the forms. And I was walking down my street coming from the bus, coming home from work, and I see this tall spire of aconitum, monkshood. I don't know if you all call it that. We call it monkshood. And it's doing this. It's wiggling, standing up, this long spike. And I was like, what is happening? And then all of a sudden, the whole spike just got sucked underground.
What?
And I was like, oh my God, what just
was
happened?
It? A mole?
It was a gopher.
Oh, wow.
A gopher. And it was really devastating. And, but it, taught me my now lifelong relationship with gophers and to appreciate what they do in engineering our soil and waterways. But, it was really startling. But I had lavender and roses, and I had little vegetable beds where I grew a lot of lettuce. And here's what I had in my first garden. I had the most fun a person can ever have. And I was like up early, and, I would take classes in nurseries or go to workshops, and it was great. It was really great.
I remember that feeling. I remember my first adult garden too, and it had loads of veggies. We had soil, like we were making it from scratch. So we had soil delivered, and it must have been really rich and fertile because we just had so much success, which we didn't have subsequently because we didn't have the knowledge to like build and nourish the soil again. But that first garden, and we had loads and loads of cosmos, and I just remember cosmos higher than myself, and that feeling of going out there and just being in the presence of this magical thing that grew from a seed, and now it's taller than you. I just remember that feeling. It's lovely to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. And I think, this is why it's so important that we don't shame people that are just coming into gardening. We just help them succeed, because if you get that first success under your belt, you're in it for life. Yeah. And same with me. I moved from Seattle thinking that I was a great gardener, moved back to Colorado, and, at 8,000 feet with, 12 inches of rain a year.
It's different.
Dry and hot and cold and windy. I had a lot less success. So,
but you're invested at that point.
But I was in. I was in. Yes.
Tell me about Cultivating Place. So you started with this public radio program that's also a podcast. Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden. Yeah. How did it begin?
Well, I was working at Microsoft, and I was an editor, and I was in love with this first garden. So all I wanted to do was write about the garden, think about the garden, read about other gardeners, read about other gardens. My mother was a great garden visitor. So every time we traveled together or she came to visit me, we would go see great gardens. And so I kept trying to move my work at Microsoft towards more gardening. I'd, propose an idea because I was working on their Encarta encyclopedia, one of the first digital encyclopedias. And I was like, we should add an article for every, public garden in the world. We should write an article on every garden tool in the world. And they kept being like, no, just stick with adding the presidents, Jennifer, or, whatever. So, but I did find myself writing a lot. And as we do gardeners, we see metaphors and we see analogies, and we realize that the garden is teaching us patience and perseverance and gratitude and generosity and all these things. So what I did, because Microsoft kept thwarting me, is I went and started volunteering for a community newspaper, which was a like simplicity living, a simple living, kind of circular living paper. It was, I think, a weekly called the Finney Ridge Review. And I said, I want to come and just volunteer to write articles. And they were so thrilled. And so I just visited little gardens. I visited with gardeners, and I would write up these articles for this paper. And it was so much fun. And the fun part was not the writing or the getting published, but that in order to extend an interview invitation to somebody, it gave them a reason to accept you coming into their garden, you coming in, right? Like you calling me and saying, will you interview me? Will you let me interview you? And so what I found was it was this great icebreaker for meeting just really interesting people. And across this whole time, so that would have been 1998, I started doing that. And every time I interview somebody, I am reminded of what good people do and how good people can be in this world. Mm-hmm. And that is such a beautiful kind of piggy bank to be able to lean back into at moments when you worry about the human species. So, but as I started to expand, like where I was turning in interviews and turning in writing, I got really, especially because at this point I had one and then quickly thereafter a second daughter of my own. And I started to see this like really unsettling trend in where I wanted to see my writing because I thought it was, like making it, and it was like the top level of, what garden writers did. It was becoming these places, these publications, whether they were books or they were magazines or they were, newspaper columns, they just felt increasingly commercial and increasingly commodified, and as though gardening was an object and a status symbol, not this lifelong relationship. And I didn't want to feel like my writing was adding to more consumerism or commodification in our world. I didn't want to see my writing on the page opposite a page advertising plants that I knew were poorly grown and treated with chemicals and shipped across the country and probably invasive somewhere. That just really felt like such a serious philosophical disconnect. And so my daughters were, I think 5 and 7 when we moved to Northern California. And I used that moment to leave 2 sort of long-term garden writing relationships and like really rethink what I wanted to do. And it was really shortly into living in Northern California that, I'm not sure how many of your audience are international or how many are Australian, but in the US, we have this public radio system, which is sort of like public education or public libraries. It is federally supported, it is state supported, it is privately supported so that it is free and accessible all the time. And it is supposed to, it's in theory commercial free, but there are underwriters, there are some underwriting messages, but it is based on the ideal that communally we have this set of knowledge or information that should be transmitted back to the whole community and that the community should have access to, and that the community should therefore support it. So I'm a big believer in public radio. And when I was driving around in Northern California, I was listening to the local public radio station, and they were making a call for people to come in and help out with their public service announcements. I've always been a member of my local public radio station, meaning I like send them, a small amount of money every month to help them keep going. And I thought that's what I should do, is I should have a public radio program, because then, it expands what you can talk about beyond just what our gardens look like. And I love what my garden looks like. I love what your garden looks like. But if we can get beyond that superficial, it's a lot less easy or convenient or possible for somebody to diminish that into a two-dimensional object that they can sell in a pretty magazine, right? So I went in and I said, I think I should have a garden program on your station. And it was like one of those weird fluke moments of total, like confidence and boldness. And, and just being like, I don't care if they say no.
That's
I'm going to go in and ask anyway. And I'd never been on the radio or like never, had anything like that.
Yeah.
And luckily, it's a small station and very community minded. And the director of programming was this great old like radio voice guy, Joe O. And he said, I think that sounds great. We'd love to have you do that. And you don't have to write public service announcements. Like, just come in and work on this.
That's so cool.
And he totally trained me. He set me up, and I did a small radio program for about 7 years, totally volunteer every single week, until it grew up into Cultivating Place in 2016. And I'm just really grateful that they believed in me, and it was a total labor of love, and privilege, a total labor of privilege, because I was taking care of my girls. I had flexible time. My husband at the time was worked so many hours that it just wasn't possible to have one of us. We either had to pay for full-time care if I was also going to go and leave the house for a full-time job, or one of us was going to stay home, and that someone was me. And so, which I did for the first 7 to 8 years of my girls' life. And so that position of privilege of being able to stay home and make it on my husband's pay allowed me this flexible amount of time to build this thing. And then in 2016, the radio station came to me and said, we would like to grow this into a 1-hour program that we syndicate and offer nationally. And we will pay you and we will support you. Will you do it? And I was like, yes, I'll do it. That sounds great. Yeah. So, and it was, at this point, by that point, through the garden writing and then through the first iteration of the radio program, it was really clear to me that I wanted to talk about why we garden and what our gardens mean and how our gardens impact so much more than we see them impacting in so many ways, culturally, economically, the environmental aspect is so easy to see, especially now. And we've got such traction there. And I'm so happy for that, and that I was part of that time period in any way. But I still see us having the need to speak more expansively, and allow the word garden to get taken out of the box it's been imprisoned in. Because and I think you will understand this in Australia. The indigenous people of Australia have been tending that land. Yes. We know for thousands of years. That's gardening. It's gardening on a larger scale, and it has, different seasonal nature for, different boundaries, but it is absolutely tending to plants in our place for all of these reasons.
Yes.
And to not see it that way, I think, is to kind of impoverish what this activity means across time and space. So that was a really long answer, Bethan.
I love that story. I love that you had this calling just to go in there and ask for what you wanted, and then they embraced you, and it's grown into this. It's grown into Cultivating Place. I love about Cultivating Place, there's lots of shows about how we garden, but this is about why. And that why is different for everyone, I'm guessing, but there are so many beautiful reasons to keep a garden. And this human impulse, you say the human impulse to garden, and that line really hooked me, because I have felt that impulse myself, and I've seen it in other places. I remember we were renters for forever, and so we would go from place to place and moved like 10 times in 10 years. And every time it was like, okay, where can we grow things? Mm-hmm. And that impulse was like the first thing, where's the sun? What can we grow? But I've seen it in other places, and a story that comes to mind was that we visited New Caledonia, which is close to here. It's Pacific nation, close to here. And we drove right up to the top of the main island, and it's very remote. There's like wild wilderness everywhere surrounding. And in the north, there are lots of Kanak tribes living very simply. And we drove past the houses, and it struck me that these houses are pretty well enveloped by nature, enveloped by plants. And yet on the roadside, there were stalls in front of every house, and they were selling plants, and they were selling ornamental plants as well. And so it wasn't a deficit of plants, because, you know, you can understand someone in New York City filling their house with plants because they need them around. It wasn't just that there was no deficit of plants. The forest was enveloping and engulfing these little tiny houses. And yet there was this impulse to grow something, not only for food, that's another reason, but because there's something inside us that tending plants to make it beautiful, to just be there, to be the carer and caretaker of these plants. That really struck me when we were driving through that place. Yeah, this impulse is
it's strong. We know it's strong across so much time. Like, there was recently a report indicating that carbon dated pollen, proved that people had been manipulating plant pollination.
Oh, wow.
14,000 years ago in order to get a new plant, in order to and no one knows exactly why, but it was evident that something had been crossed with something else purposefully. And, you know, I think we know this intuitively, that, you know, since two people have been walking on 2 feet, we have been eating things that eat plants, and therefore we've manipulated the plants in order to get the things that eat the plants to go where we want them so that we can eat them. But then we've been eating plants. We've been using them for medicine and houses and, you know, spirit. And, you know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, did you put your garden in? And by that, they mean your summer vegetable garden. Like that's what often people refer to as a garden. But we know that there's like no culture on the planet that has only grown plants for food. They have always also grown the flowers and the fragrance and the seeds and the herbs. Like the idea that anyone ever was subsistence farming is, again, like a dismissal and a diminishment of what that actually looks like on the ground in real life, because there are flowers, there is medicine, there is spirit, all there.
Tied together.
Tied together.
Let's talk about your mum's passion for flowers, because I have this passion as well. And there's something about flowers that we want in those big moments. We want them at weddings, we want them at funerals, we want them at parties and births and graduations. We want flowers around us for those big moments. And I'm fascinated by this. When my father died a couple of years ago, I was in London, and I had this intense need to be near flowers. And it just happened that we were right in the center of London, and they had seeded the moat of the Tower of London with wildflowers. And it was the most incredible healing moment for me, because I had flowers all around me, and that was exactly what my heart needed. But what is it about flowers, do you think?
Well, I think there is a lot of cultural coding that comes with that we know they are something that is traditionally offered in the Western world, but we know this is true of other cultures too, right? And we know that the flowers have developed and succeeded and expanded their hold on the planet because of this very attraction. Like they have evolved to be attractive, to be, magnanimous and beautiful. But why we turn to them in these moments, there is clearly something that is both nurture and nature here. And I'm sure it has to do as well, like if you were, a neurologist, there's some kind of sensory integration and sensory regulation that happens because of the pheromones, because of the colors, because of just the greenness of them and the livingness of them, but the otherness of them as well, that somehow like allows us to like just settle physically, but also hold our imaginations with this idea that a flower can die and it will come back again next year, right? Like there is this also resurrection story there that is, something that religions across time and space have also harnessed in order to hold us and comfort us and maybe sometimes manipulate us, and which is, I think, also what flowers do, right? They are, they need to get pollinated. They need their seeds dispersed.
Some of them do crazy tricks.
And, but that's okay. If I'll take their crazy tricks any day of the week, right? Especially over human tricks.
It is, that thing that you mentioned earlier about finding metaphor and lessons in nature. I think flowers can teach us that about everything being ephemeral and also everything being in a cycle. And that's a special
ephemeral
thing.
But eternal.
I like
and that
that.
it's not an either or, it's an and also. And was your father a flower person?
He was a naturalist. He was just a backyard naturalist. He just loved looking at, he had a hand lens which I have inherited, and he kept it all the time in his pocket. And he loved growing mold in a petri dish and looking at it with a microscope.
That's great.
He just loved little things,
Well, and I think that's the other thing, because when I think about when my mother died 30 years ago, and there is something I think in which our plants, and then by extension our gardens, they hold story and narrative, right? And I think this is in part what is so compelling about nature journaling, is that it allows us to then transmit some of the narrative in both image and word onto a solid page that we can hold. But I see a particular rose, I see a peony, and I see my mom.
Yes.
And so there's this like they hold these other personal histories as well as collective histories for us, and that's very powerful.
That's powerful. Yeah. I would love to ask you about your place, what you see when you go outside, your garden, and the spaces that make you feel like you're at home. And a listener actually had a question for you and would love to hear you describe your favorite place with all of your senses.
So I currently have the great joy of having two places that I call home. One is my house in town in Chico, California, that is a small suburban, newer house. I think it was built in 2014. I moved into it on the heels of a divorce, a very painful divorce. And this house is such a container for this time in my life, which is both painful, but also really growing and healing for me. It's where I wrote all 3 books. It's where my girls call home. It's where I had my next own garden. and where I started cultivating place, where I do most of my work still. And my partner, John, whose house and land I also call home, he helped me create the garden there, a couple of years after I moved in. And, right now it's just exploded with roses. It's very much a spring garden. Yeah. So I have probably 7 different, old roses in bloom right now. I have Winchester Cathedral. I have Narrow Waters. I have Claire Matin. I have another deep pink fragrant one whose name I'm forgetting, Zéphirine Drouhin. But I also have scented geraniums. I have a little tiny square of turf lawn that's a native grass turf. I have gardenias, and I have an espaliered lemon tree that is loaded with blooms right now. So it's a very fragrant garden. It's small. The way John and I designed it, it's very enclosing and protective. I love that about a garden,
with the little spaces that make you feel almost enclosed.
Yes. And then out the front of that house, which is where I look from my desk, we designed, there's a little courtyard, and then there was a sort of front yardish area that sloped off to the sidewalk, and it was completely empty when I moved in, which meant that you felt very exposed from the street. And we put in a big border of iceberg roses, which are like so pedestrian, so ordinary, but so bulletproof. And they stay a beautiful fresh green in the California summer, which is unusual. They take very little water. And that fresh green is something you're just hungry for come like July, August. Yeah. You in Australia know. And then in front of that, it's all natives. So native salvias and native manzanitas and native, big native grasses. So it's this like great tangle of habitat, and it's just filled with quails and sparrows this time of year. So that's the town garden. But the canyon garden, John's house, is 10 acres in a very rural, you drive on a dirt road for a mile.
Oh, wow.
You're out in this like sloping oak canyon that goes down to a year-round creek. And so like right now talking to you, I'm looking out at what is a sea of spring grass. Oh. We're still in our green season. It will end soon because I think we've had our last rain, and it was 86 today. It'll be up in the 90s, and soon enough we'll be in the hundreds for 3 months, 4 months. But right now it's just filled with wildflowers and the fresh green of the oaks leafed out, and the creek and there's a beautiful thick vegetation along the creek that allows for a lot of bird life. And right now there is a pair of bluebirds that are nesting in a box outside my office window here. So I'm like just incredibly lucky. And John is a plantsman. He loves propagating things and growing things. And he also loves, we have a vegetable garden, but he loves roses and flowers and anything that feed the bumblebees. So,
oh, what a beautiful description. Thank you. I am thinking about the feeling, that feeling of being out there, and you've touched on it. And it's a hard thing to describe because sometimes you've talked about being in love with that first garden. It very much feels like that. When I've tried to describe this feeling, I call it shimmering joy because it's like a feeling that's moving inside me, and it's a feeling of connection, a feeling of just it's almost bouncing inside me. And I wonder about how you describe that feeling, how you name it, and how you talk about it.
Those are great. First of all, I just love shimmering joy. And it speaks that word because it's both a visual we can see and it's moving. Seems very apt because there's something about that, and it's not that I feel it all the time that I'm outside. It's not that, but, sometimes I just feel the mosquitoes and the dirt on my nose. But that feeling of connection when you are fully like in the space with the plants, with the air, with the sound of the creek, with the stars above, with the, whatever it is when you walk out and you're in your space. And it could literally just be your pots on the front stoop, totally. Right? Like it doesn't have to be 10 acres in a creek. It can be little, but for me, I think I often speak of it as transcendent.
Yes.
It is very spiritual for me. It is very much like that moment when my daughters were born or being at the bedside of my mother and grandmother as they passed. Like there is this understanding that I am a very, very small but content part of a very big and beautiful energy. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear that and I feel that too. It is about a connection with the whatever it is that's bigger than us. This whole network, this whole world, really, where it's incredible and improbable that we're here and we get to see it and we get to manipulate it in this beautiful way. And that makes me think of the book that you wrote about seeds, What We Sow, on the personal, ecological and cultural significance of seeds. And when I hold a seed, I have this feeling of like intense amazement at the potential of this thing.
Yeah.
What it can do, what it can grow, and then to watch it and then that feeling again of like wonder and amazement when that seed turns into a seedling. I'd love to talk to you about this beautiful book. What drew you to exploring this relationship with seeds and that feeling of putting a seed in the ground and watching it growing?
Well, it was really, I think, most gardeners, if they don't start with seed, they eventually come to seed. And there is this understanding, like that miracle and great excitement when you see your first seeds germinate. And you're like, how did that happen? Right. So I think this is a perennial, experience for gardeners, but it was during the pandemic, John and I had to come home early from what was supposed to be a long tour for my first book. And we went to order seeds because we knew we were going to be home when we thought we weren't going to be home. And we hadn't planned our spring vegetable garden and we knew we wanted to plant some things. So we got online to like make sure we had the right carrot seed or the right lettuce seed or whatever it was. And we were really struck with how quickly, like within a matter of weeks, our global seed supply ground to a halt
because of demand.
Well, I think it was there was a lot of problem.
Okay.
Like that, multiple problems that confluenced right there. Huge unexpected demand. Global shipping stalling because of protocols and worry and people not knowing how this was being transmitted, where, and so like a real shutdown on movement of humans and things. And then the realization, or the reality rather, that most of our seed at some point goes through a very small funnel of a small seed company collecting, labeling, storing, packaging, and then shipping the seed to us. And so they too were struck with like, we can't have 15 people in here packing today. We can only have 2, or we can have none. Yeah. And so like, until people figured it out, like there was just a stop in our small scale seed supply because people couldn't be together. And there was mandated shelter in place across, a lot of these industries and almost, I think, all of the US. I don't think there was not a place that was not on shelter in place for a good portion of time. And so all of these problems led to this back order and backlog. But what it brought to light for me was that, given how long I have been gardening, how much I, think I know about gardening, how many gardeners I've talked to and blah, 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 you would think that I had a better sense of this global seed supply, but I really didn't. And it was this realization that, I knew that there was a problem at the commodity seed level with consolidation of our seed into a couple of corporate hands, but there was a part of me that was sort of like, that's a faraway problem that's not really related to me, right? Or I knew there were issues with genetically modified seeds. And on principle, just reflexively, I was sort of like, well, I don't want genetically modified seeds. But that was kind of a knee-jerk reaction that when I hit this moment of like, what don't I know about seeds? And a deep understanding that as a caring gardener, to not be paying more attention to what was happening with the seeds in our world, those seeds grown and tended and sold by people, I was both ignorant and complicit in any of these problems that weren't really that far away, that are in fact directly related to who I am as a gardener and what I grow and support in this world. And so I thought, well, I've got at least a little while sitting at home thinking about these things. I might as well work on a little research and finding out more and educate myself. And the more I read and the more interviews I conducted, and I had already done quite a few seed keeper interviews for the podcast. It had been a recurring theme across the years. And so when I started this research, I sort of started with those interviews I'd already done and then started building out from there. And it was a really interesting, very depressing in some ways research project, but also very, much like gardening itself, very encouraging, like to meet and speak with and learn about the work of so many people working hard to protect the integrity of our seeds and to keep the great diversity of them, whether they're cultural or ornamental or, like historic or new. It was very heartening to see such activism in places that you just don't even know that it's happening in some cases. So
yeah, and these things grow up around what's important. So seed saving networks, seed swap parties, people who are really committed to heirloom varieties and and nourishing them and swapping them. These things grow up. And I think that you mentioned it before, but you said that to keep gardening in a box is to not give it its due or not give it enough credit for what it creates. And I think that community and gardens are so tied, and communities spring up around these important things. Communities of people who love seeds, communities of people who love congregating in green spaces. And that's what that's what brings to my mind when I read your book, is just that these beautiful groups develop out of a need. And a need, but also a mutual, like a common ground, right? And I think this is, and you said it early on, there is this green thing inside all of us, right? And so it is, especially in this moment when things feel so polarized. Yes.
Even though I know that at least 4 of my neighbors, middle-aged white women, voted for a candidate I did not vote for, I'm still able to say to them as they walk by my front habitat garden and say, oh my gosh, I love your roses. I can still find it in my heart to say, you are welcome to pick them anytime you want.
Yeah.
Happy to share. Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing. And I'd love to hear you speak a little about, well, in this time that we're going through right now, which feels like a really scary time for On a certain, it feels like a really scary time, and the changes are really rapid. There's removal of protections for public lands.
Ugh,
I'm wondering, for you, what role gardens can have in fostering community resilience, as gardening is an act of resistance in itself, and gardens being places of refuge, places of hope, because hope feels a little lacking at the moment. And I wonder if you could speak about gardens as activism in
Right.
itself, but also gardens as places of hope.
Well, I think in all the ways we've already been talking about, but it goes right back. Like, it is a scary time. And I think people are panicked and angry and worried and tired. And all of our sort of scarcity mindset comes to the fore, and our kind of isolationism. And I think that the very first way that they are a place of refuge and hope and optimism and resistance is that to go into your garden and to be with your plants, you automatically feel better.
Yeah.
You automatically feel like, it goes right back to that physical, sensory, and neurological regulation. So it brings you, hopefully, out of a state of panic and into a state of, if not cooperation, at least care. And from a position of care and of sensory regulation, and we can make better decisions, and we can be better people ourselves. I know I can. And so to start from there, then you do say, okay, I will offer my neighbor the white roses that she loves, because that is one way to bridge what seems like an absolutely unbridgeable gap. And it also allows me to say, okay, so if this garden in the front of my house allows me to help build community with people I'm feeling very discommunity with, how can it help support my community in other ways? And I think this is going to be different for everybody, but the more I do what I do, Bethan, the more I feel so strongly that the gardeners who I see marrying their love of gardening and tending to plants to the other things they love and care about in this world, the more reach and positive impact they have in those other areas. So, this could be cooking. This could be raising your kids. This could be meeting your neighbors. This could be saving seeds and going to that seed swap and building community. It could be, finding a way into a space of spirit and, full-bodied religion that you feel disenfranchised from in another place. It could be, I think the more I interview people, the more I see people put this to use in some of the most surprising ways, but ways that when it happens, really, really grow the world better. And I've started literally in the last month, I have started to try and express this more beautifully somehow, or more succinctly somehow. And, the word gardener, the word garden exists on a spectrum, just like the word artist or mother or, teacher, whatever.
Yeah.
And in that spectrum, there's somebody who does it this way, but the more I see these people that combine what they care about in this world with their impulse to garden, the more I see, I define these people as sort of big G gardeners. And I see them as like a subspecies of the human species. And when I see them at work and I look in overview at all that they make happen in the world, I think of them very similarly to the plants or animals we refer to as keystone species. And that if you were to take those gardeners away from the place they live in, that whole ecosystem, culturally, economically, environmentally, would not function as well. And I think one of the things that happens when we dismiss or diminish the idea of gardens and gardeners is that we it's a euphemism for undervaluing them. And one of the consequences is that they are overlooked and underpaid and undereducated and undersupported. But that if we could get the world as a whole to see the value of these really impactful gardeners, the more we support them and value them and pay them and give them benefits and thank them, the more we give permission slip to all gardeners to move further along this spectrum of this being a part of what makes us who we are, you know.
That's a really powerful reflection, that matching up life and gardens, because parenting can be done in gardens, because cooking can be done in gardens, because community growth and sharing can be done in gardens, and you kind of double down on the power of all of those things when you do them outdoors with plants in community. I think community, for me, the more I think about this, the more I talk about it, the more community and gardens are just completely enmeshed. And I know that my son, who doesn't like eating vegetables, he'll eat vegetables right out of the garden. And he does that even more when there's a friend there with him. And he's calmer and, you know, happier when he's outside. And so am I. And I'm calmer and happier when I'm in community. So I love the way you spoke about the layering and the putting together the parts of life that are just better when you're outside.
Yeah. And it's not, you know, I mean, I think there's a lot of research that says it really is just outside, you know, that we feel better just in the presence of trees. But, and so there is, I think, a conversation happening of like, well, we don't, you know, we need to ungarden. We need to stop gardening. We need to, because we just make a big mess and we ruin everything and we hurt things and we alter the land. And so we should rewild and we should ungarden. And I understand this. I understand why we are struggling with some of the baggage that comes with, especially the colonial aspects of what gardening has meant in Western European traditions. But I also know that eliminates what we also know to be millennia long partnering of people with plants. And so, you know, the idea of like us stepping out of the way and rewilding by just not doing anything, it takes away all of the history of the indigenous land-based peoples everywhere who have made beautiful and collaborative and working ecosystems because they are there.
Yes.
And you know, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer talks quite a bit about this, as do other writers. But I think there is a person whose work I admire greatly out of Ireland, Mary Reynolds, who says we should get rid of the word gardener and we should not be gardeners. We should be guardians. And like I say, I have nothing but respect for her work, but I can't go with her there because the word guardian has as much like problematic oversight and hierarchy in it as the word garden has kind of baggage. And so I would rather reclaim the fullness of this word in its collaboration and partnership, not its dominion, not its, you know,
control or
not its control, but its partnering, which, you know, there is control in that. Like, you know, the native peoples of California burned the land so that the trees would not take over, so that they would have meadows, so that the, you know, deer and bison could graze.
And Robin
that
Wall
is
Kimmerer, she talks about reciprocity and giving and receiving from nature, and that's a really powerful thing to me.
Very, very. And I think, you know, that exchange, when we talk about just going outside being a form of, you know, benefit for us, I think there, you know, everything is energy. So there is this exchange that happens that is definitely two-way and is definitely beautiful.
And a source of hope.
And a great source of hope. Yeah.
Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me. It's been absolutely magical to talk to you about gardens and about community and about hope. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And so, wait, I wanted to show you some of my garden journal.
Oh my goodness. Tell me everything.
Well, I love to just collect little things that come
my
by the
goodness.
day. Those aren't mine. That's somebody else's art. Other people's little, art. And I try to sketch because I am not a particularly genius sketcher, but I know it's so good for my brain. And I know it activates such a different way of envisioning you can see there's like
a little landscape.
So I am not nearly the artist you are, but I have fun with it. And I'm trying to incorporate more color.
What kinds of observations do you put down?
I often use it to help remember what I was seeing in a particular moment, especially if I don't exactly have words for what I was feeling. I'll try and just capture like a shape.
That's why words and pictures are so powerful together, because sometimes you have the pictures but you don't have the words, and sometimes you've got the words but not the pictures.
Right. And something about asking yourself to sketch or do any kind of color work as well sometimes shows me what drew, where my words wanted to go, what drew me. So because you'll kind of start with whatever was the focus maybe, or maybe you can't start on the focus. You have to come in from the edges to find what the center is. But it allows me to concentrate and see in a different way when I'm trying to sketch it versus trying to be verbal about it. Yeah. And I think that is really helpful. And it allows me, I think, to also ground into the intimacy of the details in a way a little bit like gardening, that, when you're planting something or when you're seeding something, you learn details about it that you couldn't learn otherwise. Like, what does this seedling look like?
Yes.
It's different than the grown plant.
Yes.
And you have to have that time-based relationship in order to know that piece of information.
Yes.
And I think when you're trying to draw or sketch or color or, whatever you might describe it as, or paint or sculpt, you have to look at the details in a way that you otherwise would not. And that teaches you something more about this other life or space.
Yeah, something about putting it down just helps you remember it. Just as simply as that. Not only making a connection, like an emotional connection or a connection with a plant that you'll take with you forever, but it's also just the knowledge of it. If you're trying to remember something, a great way to do it is putting it down. Did your mum used to keep garden journals? Or
she absolutely kept a garden journal. She kept track of every plant she put in, every receipt, every, when she harvested. Like, she was much more methodical than I am. And she didn't sort of wander off into, her thoughts of the day. I mean, sometimes she did, but it was rare. But it's so fun to look back at her journals, which we have a couple of, where, you just see when she planted this. It was really fun, and the names of different plants, and you'd be like, oh, that's the one I want to go get. So
that's amazing. What an amazing thing to have in your hand, a record of her garden activities as well.
And when my father passed last year, and we found a journal that the two of them had kept on at this cabin where he was doing his early research. And so they'll be alternating without rhyme or reason, alternating handwriting. And, he'll talk about we saw 4 mallard ducks. We saw 3, beavers. We saw, and, my mother will write down everything that was in bloom. And then he will come back in with the Latin names of what those plants were. It was really great. It was great to see that journal.
That is so cool. And when did you start keeping your own garden journal? Was that from the beginning?
My very first garden in Seattle, I think, was my first garden journal. And it was because my mother gave it to me with that first garden when I got started. At Christmas, she gave me a little journal book. So
that is beautiful. Thank you so much for showing me that.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jennifer. I was so thrilled to see her garden journal and hear about her mother's meticulous garden notes and the story of the collaborative journal kept by her parents. What an incredible document to have. I'm excited that Jennifer is going to be a guest speaker at the 2025 Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference, which is on later in this year. I can't wait to hear that session. Links to where you can find Jennifer and Cultivating Place online are in the show notes for this episode, as well as the titles for Jennifer's 3 books, which I recommend you purchase from your local independent bookstore. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.